This year, we celebrate a particular anniversary. We, the students of Hadrian's Wall, and indeed all Roman frontiers. For 100 years ago, this year, RG Collingwood published a paper looking at the purpose of Hadrian's Wall. It's a paper which reverberates even today. Collingwood was from a well-known north of England family, and he is seen here visiting the excavation at Bedoswald in 1929. In the foreground, from left, is John Charlton, Eric Burley with the pipe, Mr. Hunter, a student, facing us, F.G. Simpson. To his left is Mr. Addison from Newcastle, another student. Kurt Stade pouring a libation from Germany. Facing us again is Shimon Applebaum, later famous Israeli archaeologist, but at this time a student at Oxford, and behind him stands RG Collingwood. Socially distanced in the back are the workmen, and to the left is Thomas Heppel, who was the foreman. Now, Collingwood came to see the excavation and he hoped that an inscription would be found, but it wasn't. So instead, this photograph was arranged, taken by Ian Richmond, with Eric Burley and Kurt Stade pouring a libation on the mock altar. Collingwood left shortly afterwards, and the two slabs on which they're standing were lifted and found to be two inscriptions, one dating to the year 200, or thereabouts, and the other to about 300. And these two inscriptions were very important because they were seen as the basis for the later chronology of Hadrian's Wall in a scheme of dating which continued for the next 30 or 40 years. So who was RG Collingwood? His father, W.G. Collingwood, was the private secretary of John Ruskin, who lived at Brantwood beside Lake Coniston in the Lake District. W.G. Collingwood was an archaeologist, and he was also an artist. And he designed a memorial to the dead of the First World War, which still stands in Coniston Churchyard in the form of a Celtic cross, which was widely copied. Collingwood had sisters. One of them was to marry Angus Graham, later Secretary of the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Scotland, and another was to marry a Syrian surgeon, and their children were the exemplars for the Walker family in Arthur Ransom's Swallows and Amazon books. Arthur Ransom was a friend of the family. Collingwood became Professor of Metaphysical Philosophy at Oxford, but in his early 20s, he started excavating here at Ambleside, at the head of Windermere. In 1930, after the First World War, he became more interested in Hadrian's Wall. This, of course, is Mark Castle number 39 on Hadrian's Wall, looking towards Howsteads. And in 1921, he published a paper in an obscure journal which no longer exists, the Vasculum, a vasculum being a container in which botanical samples are carried. This was a local journal of science and local history. And this short paper was entitled The Purpose of the Roman Wall. Now, before we examine that, we should consider what the current views were of the purpose of Hadrian's Wall. And the general one up until the middle of the 19th century is that it was an impermeable barrier. It's not surprising. It was a substantial stone-built wall running from sea to sea. It blocked off the natives, the indigenous population of the north, from the, as the Romans saw it, more civilized inhabitants of the Roman province. But in 1847, the workmen of John Clayton of Chester's, a man who created, in effect, an archaeological park along Hadrian's Wall, owning at least 15 miles of wall and 5 forts along it, and setting his workmen to clear the ruins. These workmen found at Caulfields a Mar Castle and a gate through its northern wall. And views changed as a result. It was no longer seen that the enemy was so fierce that the Romans had to bar all contact with them. No, instead, the gates indicated that there was contact and the Romans operated north of the wall. A popular view was created. This, by Forestier, also dates the 1920s. It shows a group of soldiers looking out to the north, standing on top of the wall with a low parapet. And this view perhaps reached its most extreme in the drawing in Kipling's Book of Books Hill, which you see here. The Roman soldiers are approaching Hadrian's Wall, an enormously high barrier bristling with artillery. And this is the view that Collingwood sought to challenge. So what were his arguments? They were straightforward. The Roman army was an offensive force, so its soldiers were not equipped with defensive weapons. The access points along the line were too far apart for defense. There were no locations for artillery along the line, and it was therefore basically an elevated patrol walk. Kipling in Book of Books Hill said, "We are all archers on the wall." And indeed there were archers in the Roman army. Forestier's drawing to the left shows an archer on the wall, walking along the wall from the turret in the background, in the snow. Trajan's column to the right shows Syrian archers fighting in Trajan's wars just a little before Hadrian's Wall was built. But as John Coulson has pointed out, although we know that soldiers were trained in archery, there's very little evidence for its use on Hadrian's Wall. And in fact, we have hardly any evidence in the form of arrowheads, and the ones that we do have, the biggest group was found at Househeads and dates to the 4th century, well after the building of the wall. So we are not all archers on the wall. In fact, as Collingwood pointed out, each soldier was provided with 2 spears, and once he had thrown those, that was it. He had no other defensive weapons to use. Soldiers in the Roman army preferred to fight at close quarters with the infantryman on the right with his short stabbing sword and the rather longer sword of the cavalryman because he sits on a horse. Speaking of horses, there are quite a few cavalry along the line of Hadrian's Wall in the original plan. But this is rather problematic if we assume that cavalrymen, like infantrymen, were to patrol along the top of the wall. They certainly wouldn't do it sitting on their horses. And indeed, it would be a waste of these highly trained and expensive soldiers to use them merely on patrol duty. So this is another small enigma on Hadrian's Wall. Collingwood assumed that the towers along Hadrian's Wall would be similar to the one on the right, which has been prepared by Michael Moore. Shows a tall tower with a soldier observing from the top and a wall walk. These were roughly 500 meters apart. And Albert Folio has pointed out that this distance is about that at which observers can distinguish friend from foe, civilian from military. And so the distance relates to that particular ability to observe. The distance between the turrets relates to something other than access, in short. Collingwood pointed out that if a soldier was killed on top of the wall, or a couple of soldiers on a patrol walk as narrow as this, it would impede help coming towards the defenders. In fact, we don't even know that a turret on Hadrian's Wall looked like this. To the left, Michael Moore has drawn for us a turret based on those on Trajan's Column. And I think the only point I would cavil at is that as we've found so few fragments of tiles or slates on Hadrian's Wall, the roof was probably of wooden shingles. And there is no wall walk. And there are no locations for artillery. Here, we're looking at Alan Sorrell's famous view of the wall, showing a broad wall walk, soldiers walking up and down it, steps along it, and towers along it. But there is no evidence from these towers for weapons of used in by artillery, catapults or ballista, and in fact, no evidence for such machines themselves. So indeed, was it merely a sentry walk, as Forestier implies and Collingwood stated? But Collingwood said that if, indeed, we might say when, though we have no evidence that the wall was actually attacked, according to ancient literature, apart from one occasion, when or if the wall was attacked, the soldiers would open the north gate and march out to fight in the open. These are legionaries, not based on Hadrian's Wall, but the auxiliaries would march out to fight in the open, as we see this soldier here on Trajan's Column, fighting Dacians. Spear in his right hand, now lost from the column, but his armor, arms, including his shield, better training, discipline, as well as that equipment, all put him in the position where each Roman soldier knew that they had an advantage over the enemy and in most circumstances would prevail. So was there indeed a wall walk? Every reconstruction drawing of Hadrian's Wall that I know of shows a wall walk. It also shows a fairly broad wall. But the wall wasn't everywhere that size. Here, from left to right, from the man standing beside the wall in the center, to the figure to the right, we've got a wall which was, broadly speaking, the same as that which we have seen as Sorrell provided for his section. But here, at Brunton Turret, the wall as finished was much narrower, only 5'6" wide, 1.7 meters. And the two ladies on the top give us an excellent idea of the situation if we were to raise them up another 10 feet. We don't have a parapet along the north side, but you see that you put a couple of figures on the wall and they have very little space for movement. I've shamelessly here stolen from Paul Bidwell's excellent report on Hadrian's Wall at Wall's End, his drawing of Hadrian's Wall as he saw it. This is what we call the narrow wall. The wall is finished off, not the broad wall that was started, but a wall which was 7'6" wide. And as we've seen at Brunton, sometimes less than that, with a parapet walk to protect the soldier, standing on the top with his spear. Now this wall, Paul Bidwell has argued, was about 12 foot wide. This is what Bede said it was back in 731 AD. though there is evidence, for example, at Mountcastle 48, from the staircase, which part of which survives, that the wall was 12 foot high on the inside, 14 feet high on the outside. And the Mountcastle gates, when restored, give us a height of about the same, 14, 15 feet. Now, if I was 12, 13, 14, or 15 feet high above the ground, I think I would want protection not just on the north side, but on the south side, especially if it was forestier soldiers in the snow, which would turn to ice, slippy, with the wind blowing, in the gloom, possibly the dark. I think I would want extra protection in the form of a southern parapet. And indeed, in North Africa, we have such a wall where the walkway is protected on each side by a wall like this to the right. But of course, this reduces the maneuverability of the soldiers, who has to swing his spear to throw it as far as possible. He has a shield on his back. He's losing maneuverability by having two protective walls. And this is in a wall which is 7'6" wide, not at Brunton 5'6" wide. But again, I ask the question, do we need a wall? The frontier in Germany was a fence, a stout fence, admittedly, but unless you were in the Roman Army Acrobatic Corps, you could not patrol along the top of this. No other frontier, apart from one in Africa, is definitively known to have had a wall walk along the top. Now, before Hadrian's Wall was even finished, well before it was finished, there was a radical change in plan. Forts were added to the wall line itself. Here at Chester's, looking north, we can see the arrows pointing to the location of Hadrian's Wall, which met the east and west sides of the fort at the southern towers of the side gates. The fort sits astride the wall. Now, the results of all of this location is that now there were the equivalent of 6 Mountcastle gates opening to the north of the wall and 4 to the south, because 2 extra gates were added. So the fort is in this unique position. This occurs on no other Roman frontier. And one can only assume that the reason for this unusual positioning is it allowed Roman soldiers to operate more effectively in the wider landscape. They could move through the wall using the 4 gates to the south, the 6 gates to the north, much more easily than negotiating across country to file through a narrow Mountcastle gate. So here we see Matt Simon's a much improved version of a sketch I drew many years ago of the 2 plans for Hadrian's Wall. At the top is the first, a simple barrier, a ditch in front, Mountcastles with their gates at every mile, 2 turrets in between. With the main units of defense, the army, regiments situated behind the wall, many along the road known today as the Stane Gate. If they wanted to get to grips with the enemy, they would have to march up a couple of kilometers or more to the wall, file through the Mountcastle Gate to engage with any enemy to the north. But before that scheme was finished, forts were added to the wall line, as we see in the bottom, allowing much greater maneuverability in the landscape, both to the south and to the north. This was later restricted by the addition of the vallum, but that's another story which we're not entering into today. Now, we talked a lot about the wall being narrowed, and perhaps the reason for the narrowing was that once it ceased to have any purpose as a elevated sentry walk, as Collingwood argued it was, and perhaps that was a reason it was narrowed. And the elevated sentry walk simply abandoned. Soldiers no longer needed a wall walk on the line of the wall if they were operating in the field to the north. So Peter Connolly's drawing here, which shows a wall walk, perhaps should have none. And the towers, well, the towers along the wall rapidly became superfluous. A couple of generations after the construction of the wall, many of them were abandoned. It tells us that they were not needed. And why were they not needed? Because the soldiers operated in the open to the north of the wall. As we see here, their preference. Therefore, perhaps Mike Moore's drawing based on a tower and Trajan's column was indeed how Hadrian's wall looked, and without a wall walk, simply a sloping top. This is because the soldiers preferred to fight in the open rather than from fort walls or even linear barriers. The very clever people at Current Archaeology tweaked my proffered title into the much more interesting one: was Hadrian's Wall an expensive folly? Well, we can see that it was certainly expensive. It took a lot of men to build it, and it was possibly not even finished at Hadrian's death. And one could argue that it was a folly because it became superfluous once forts were added to the wall and the soldiers operated from the base on Hadrian's Wall out to the north to deal with any incipient trouble or indeed attack. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that exploration of Hadrian's Wall and my heretical views. If you want to explore Collingwood's views further, here is a plug, an unashamed plug for my book, The Frontiers of Imperial Rome, published by Pen and Sword recently in paperback. In the meantime, thank you very much for listening.